This video is brought to you by Babbel. Start learning a new language today. Sign up through the link below to get 50% off for 6 months for a limited time only. More on them in a bit. Do you remember the Cold War, when mushroom clouds, massive retaliation, mutually assured destruction, nuclear warheads and fallout shelters were all the rage? Well, I don't, because I didn't live through it, and pretty happy about that. But it's one of those periods in time where the more you dig, the more fascinating stories you're likely to unearth. And today, we are going to dig, indeed, beneath the picturesque countryside of Wiltshire, southern England, in search of the British government's top-secret nuclear shelter. There we'll find the central government war headquarters, known to some as the Burlington Bunker. In today's Geographics, we're going to chart the fascinating history of how CGWHQ was planned, built, organized, and thankfully never used. The British government did not wait for the Cold War to begin to start ruminating on an important existential question. What shall we do if tons of bombs from the sky make it impossible for us to work? The first formalized concerns came from the 1936 Warren Fisher Committee on the Effects of Air Raids. The committee drew up plans to have thousands of government employees relocated to the outskirts of London or even as far north as Blackpool. These plans had many critics, including future Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who questioned the effects that a fleeing government might have on morale. In fact, during World War II, most government functions remained in post with key members of the cabinet using the underground and reinforced war rooms when German bombs were directly hitting Whitehall. This established the principle of displacing only essential government figures into a bunkered facility for the limited period strictly necessary to protect their lives and ensure continuity during a crisis. As we all know, shortly after the end of World War II, an Iron Curtain descended upon Europe and a new conflict began. It was one that could send the whole world to flame in a matter of weeks. From 1949, a new concern kept British defense planners awake at night. On September 3rd, a US spy plane picked up signs of radiation off the coast of Siberia. This was the first piece of evidence that the USSR had successfully tested their first atomic bomb. The Western Bloc's strategic superiority had been nullified. Ironically, the Soviets achieved this result thanks to scientific secrets revealed by British double agent Melita Norwood. If you want to know more about this particular spy, head on over to our sister channel Biographics and search for Melita because we have a video about her. Norwood was passing on secrets from the UK's own nuclear program, led by scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project. The US had classified all files from that project, but some scientists managed to smuggle their notes to England. 3 years after the first Soviet bomb, Britain successfully tested its first nuke on October 3rd, 1952, during Operation Hurricane. The bomb was detonated inside the hull of HMS Plym, completely vaporizing the ship. Long before Hurricane was a go, defense planners had been planning for a direct nuclear hit on Britain. They assumed that in case of a nuclear conflict, Britain would be targeted by 172 nukes, 40 of which would be directed at military targets. Another 35 could destroy London, and the other 97 would be scattered across the countryside. The estimated loss of life was 1.7 million people, with another million severely injured. The deluge of fire would level 2 out of every 5 houses and cripple half of the country's industrial capacity. But as horrendous as this sounded, the Defense Ministry did not expect the attacks to cause a complete breakdown of English society or government. There would be no Mad Max scenario here, or to bring it closer to home, no Thread scenario. If this was the kingdom's nuclear forecast, then all that was needed for civil defense measures was a plan to help the population at large survive the immediate and localized effects of a nuclear strike. The same principle would be applied to government staff. A scheme was set in place to build several bunkers throughout London known as citadels, each allocated to a different branch of the government, the armed forces and the security services. The US government may have had a similar plan in place and will probably look into it in the future, but if this sounds like the inspiration for the vaults in the Fallout franchise, the most notable citadel was the awesomely codenamed Pirate. It was allocated to the Prime Minister, the Defense Secretary, and their staffs. The idea behind the Citadel scheme was that the cabinet ministers should not leave London to avoid a slump in morale, and that they should remain in hiding for as short of a time as possible. However, history got in the way. The US was making headway in developing a weapon that would put to shame the atomic bomb. the hydrogen bomb, which was successfully tested in November of 1952. The Soviets, unwilling to accept that kind of yours is bigger than mine talk, were inevitably going to catch up, and they did in November of 1955. Yet, even before the H-bomb was a reality, British defence planners had begun to lose sleep again, or more realistically, they were suffering from raging hardcore insomnia, staring at the ceiling, shaking in cold sweats, and munching on bed linen. If the communist bloc developed their own H-bomb, then a total collapse of society was indeed on the table, provided said table had not been vaporized. A report by civil servant Sir William Strath calculated that 10 hydrogen bombs at 10 megatons each would cause 16 million casualties in the UK. Half of the country would be completely devastated, and radioactive fallout would have long-term effects, trapping millions of people in their houses for weeks on end. Communications would be severely disrupted, food supplies would be contaminated or impossible to transport to those in need, the wounded and the ill would not be able to be treated. In other words, the Citadel scheme may not have been viable anymore. As early as April 1951, Cabinet Secretary Norman Brooke announced a change of plan to Prime Minister Clement Attlee. He said, "We are therefore beginning also to consider the possibility of providing some alternative seat of government in another part of the country and equipping it in advance with the necessary accommodation and communications." It was the start of a new plan, a plan to build a new central government war headquarters in a location codenamed You gotta hand it to us Brits, we are pretty good at picking code names. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister again after Attlee, and preparations for subterfuge were resumed, led by Treasury official Thomas Padmore. The central idea was to shelter a number of core government employees in the citadels, but with the option of quickly relocating them to a safer location outside of London. In September 1952, a new government report considered 5 quarries in the Corsham area, of which Spring Quarry was the first choice. Spring Quarry, as well as the whole operation to turn it into a secure post-nuclear headquarters, then became known as Subterfuge. Corsham is a historic market town of some 13,000 inhabitants located in Wiltshire, southwestern England. It can be reached from central London in about 2 hours, either by car or train, and is quite close to the cities of Bath and Bristol. The Visit Wiltshire website describes it as quintessentially English, historic buildings and acres of glorious countryside on the doorstep. It also says slightly exotic, flamboyant and loud. Peacocks regally wander the streets. While I'm sure that Thomas Padmore and his team appreciated the presence of peacocks on the streets, they were likely more interested in what lay beneath those streets. The Spring Quarry at Corsham had been held as a wartime requisition by the Ministry of Supply since the Blitz to be used as a massive storage facility. It had an enormous floor area, adequate electrical service, convenient means of access, and an underground spring for fresh water. So in November of 1953, Padmore and his working party proposed that in case of Soviet attack, a nucleus government in charge of conducting the war should be sheltered underneath London. But what about second-tier officials then? Well, the report stated that everyone else must go, which in the context of raining H-bombs is slightly sinister, but what Padmore meant was that 12,000 non-nuclear staff should be relocated to Subterfuge. A few months later, the Working Party had changed their mind. Sure, if Prime Minister Churchill or his successors stuck to London, it would do wonders for morale, but what if he got killed in the first minutes of the war? That would just shatter the British resolve. A new plan was for a small group of ministers to evacuate to Subterfuge, if possible, before an attack even took place. In other words, as soon as international tensions had escalated to a breaking point. These ministers would oversee basic survival needs in the run-up to a nuclear holocaust scenario. Then, as soon as the attack had started, the nucleus government would evacuate to the Corsham Quarry. The final plan was approved in September of 1955 by new Prime Minister Anthony Eden. And just before we continue with today's video, I do want to take a moment to tell you about today's fantastic sponsor, Babbel. Now, there are lots of reasons you might need to learn a new language: professional, personal, travel, lots and lots, or maybe you just need to brush up on a language that you sort of half know, but have forgotten a little bit. Now, you might have had a crack at learning a language on some free apps on the App Store, but Babbel go way beyond the basics. Indeed, it is the #1 language learning app in the world, and there are 14 different languages currently available to learn on here. So why is Babbel better than the rest? Well, with Babbel, you can count on people who have actual experience teaching the language rather than just relying on machine learning like other apps. It's also totally ad-free, so distraction-free, major plus. That way, you just can focus on the learning and not get distracted by adverts. It also focuses on language for real life, teaching you for situations that you're actually likely to encounter rather than just some random nonsense. They've got a website as well as this app. You can just grab the app wherever you are and be like, okay, I've got 5 minutes. I'll just do a little bit of learning right now. And all those little bits of learning, they really do add up. It's also very nicely designed. It's very easy to use. So start learning a new language today with Babbel. Get 6 months for 50% off. There is a link below, limited time only. And let's get back to it. Let's stick with Eden. Eden eventually agreed with Padmore on a monstrous budget that would be worth £20 million in today's money. The slush funds would ultimately transform the quarry into a highly secure bunker, complete with office space and living quarters for 4,000 ministers, officials, and their support staff. In 1956, Padmore started making plans on who should be among those lucky 4,000 that would hold a standing reservation in the subterfuge bunker. His team also prepared a plan for the refurbishment of the bunker along some precise guidelines. First, the facility should be reinforced with the best available practical protection against raw blast fallout and gas. The bunker was to be redesigned to host 1,000 decision-makers, supported by a further 3,000 communications and service employees. Senior staff would be entitled to 250 individual offices, which would double as bedrooms at night. Some of these senior leaders would be expected to meet in one of the 3 war rooms in the main central war room, reserved for senior cabinet secretaries and ministers, plus 1 for civil defense and a 3rd for the commanders-in-chief. All other non-senior personnel would be bunking in large dormitories, accommodating 50 places each. Overall, the inhabitants of Subterfuge would be fed by the same 2 canteens, one of which would run continuously, 24 hours a day, serviced by 3 8-hour shifts. Last but not least, the planners specified that the male-to-female ratio would be 3-to-1. Some years later, Dr. Strangelove would propose a 10-to-1 female-to-male ratio, but he had a different goal in mind.
10 females to each male.
On the other hand, Padmore's plans were strictly utilitarian, not allowing for special rest or recreation facilities. The focus initially was on plumbing, toilets, and electrical cabling. The management team also wanted to make sure that the canteen kitchens were operational and well stocked. Then, in July 1956, contractors began work on the serious stuff, a concrete blast wall that was 6 feet thick. This would completely shield the underground working areas. Similar blast caps in heavy reinforced concrete were planned to protect access points, vents, lifts, and escalators. As many fellow Britons know, the unofficial motto of the Contractors Guild is, "It's going to cost you extra, mate." Subterfuge was no exception. Cost estimates crept upwards, accounting for up to 10% of the overall home defense budget. The consequence was that every increase to the estimate had to be revised by several committees, leading to delays in construction. By 1957, development was behind the planned schedule, but the achievements were still impressive. Padmore's crew had completed the perimeter walls, the internal partitioning, and the installation of basic systems. These were the diesel-fueled generators, a ventilation system complete with anti-radiation filters, emergency water and sewage systems, and an internal communication network relying on lamps and pneumatic tubes. Oh, and also, a bakery was added to the canteen because, we can deal with the end of the world, but what is breakfast without perfectly brown toast? By June of 1959, the bulk of the infrastructure was complete. Some vital components were still missing, though, and these were components that would ensure long-term survival. These were the blast caps I mentioned earlier, some anti-radiation filters, and, most importantly, external communication capabilities. The original quarry had been fitted with a manual switchboard and telephone exchange, controlling some 500 lines, but the technology dated to prior to World War II, and it needed some updating. By now, the site had received a new code name. This name was Stockwell, a code name which actually did not stick around for long, as it was again replaced in 1961 by And this is the code name which has apparently stuck more widely with the public. By 1961, the warehouses in the quarry had been stocked with food, furniture, and stationery. Lots of it. 200,000 cubic feet worth of supplies. That's the equivalent to about 550 large trucks. Not everything was going smoothly, though. Work on the communications network had been lagging and was only about 10% complete. Eventually, a government official stuck a foot up a contractor's rear, and 1,500 telephone extensions were completed within the next 4 months. In September of 1961, the Ministry of Works reported that the Burlington bunker was now ready for use. It lay about 100 feet below the surface. It covered 35 acres of surface and was laid out along 60 miles of underground roads. Construction was officially completed in August 1962, right on time for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Presumably following that close call with the total end of the world as we knew it, Defense Staff updated the Government War Book. It would include the procedures and codes needed to alert designated staff on when and how to move to the Central Government War Headquarters under caution. The relevant code words were Grandee Bravo 3 warned designated staff for service at Turnstile. I forgot to mention that Burlington had soon been renamed to... And all of this name changing is getting kind of annoying. Anyhow, the next level of danger was Grandee Delta 4, Turnstile to be manned against all contingencies. And the top level of alert was Grandee Hotel 1, transfer control from London to Turnstile. Just to clarify, code Grandee Hotel 1 would be used before an attack took place, as soon as British armed forces had reasonable intelligence to believe that an attack was about to take place. And in November of 1965, the British government may have received such an alert. An extended power failure in North America caused the malfunction of some sensors, which were originally intended to detect nuclear blasts. The command center of the US Office of Emergency Planning received the wrong signal. America was under attack. The center went on full alert, but thankfully the military kept their cool and did not retaliate against the Russians. We can't say it with certainty, but let's pretend for a second that the UK government under Harold Wilson did receive that ominous code, Grandee Hotel 1. So, what would have happened? As per the plan, 4,000 key officials would be mobilized to reach Turnstile within 2 hours or less, preferably by RAF helicopters. Upon arrival, they would have been divided into 3 categories and assigned to their respective areas. The Prime Minister, the War Cabinet, the Chiefs of Staff, and the supporting personnel would be allocated to the inner core of the bunker, dubbed Area 14. Next to Area 14, other sections would be allocated to departments with a very active role to play during an attack and its aftermath, i.e. the military, the Ministry of Supply, Department of Health, and local government liaisons. The latter set of officials were assigned close to the communications networks, as their essential role was to keep in constant contact with the regional commissioners. These commissioners oversaw basic government functions at a local level with a certain degree of independence from the Central Government War HQ, especially if the Prime Minister and Cabinet were to perish in the initial attack. The Turnstile plans did not mention if such regional commissioners had been allocated decentralized bunkers all over the UK. However, in 1963, the organization Spies for Peace, which included philosopher Bertrand Russell, published a pamphlet leaking the existence of 12 secret RSGs, or regional seats of government, from the south of England to Northern Ireland. So yes, the regional governors were also sorted. But I've only got time for one bunker, so let's go back to Turnstile and its third area. This was indicated as general-purpose space and included the dormitories, canteens, field hospital, and workspace for their allocated personnel. The top-tier residents of Area 14 were assigned individual Type A rooms to be used both as office space and sleeping quarters. Their allocation included a metal folding bed, 1 mattress, 2 sets of blankets and bed linen, and a wardrobe. Office furniture was equally Spartan, 1 folding table, 3 chairs, and a filing cabinet. There was also a waste paper bin and an ashtray, because ministers have to have cigars in order to function. Work supplies were managed by the splendidly titled Her Majesty's Stationery Office, who had kept in stock more than 11 million sheets of duplicating paper, 10,000 pens, 100,000 rubber bands, 400 typewriters, and 12,000 toilet rolls. Now, that's only 3 rolls of toilet paper per person, so well, that wasn't going to last forever. The stationery office also prepared a small library of reference books. They must have deemed them useful, but I would question some of these choices. One of the titles was an atlas of the USSR. Okay, useful choice to pick a target for a retaliatory strike. Another one was the Russian English Technical and Chemical Dictionary, which is kind of pertinent. But how about the Guide to the House of Commons, i.e. Parliament? In the best case, a false alarm, many of these people will go back to work there the following day. In the worst case, it's already been vaporized. Another interesting choice is the Titles and Terms of Address, a guide that teaches you which title to use for various ranks of the aristocracy, military, and ruling classes. God forbid that we lose our manners when the whole world goes up in flames. There was also a detachment of the Army Catering Corps that would be on hand to provide fulfilling meals. Supplying fresh food at Turnstile was a problem, so the Army simply stocked 120,000 Army rations, 1,500 tins of biscuits, and an undisclosed quantity of chocolate bars and cigarette cartons. Another pre-nuke nicety would not be allowed, though. Turnstile would be completely dry and alcohol-free. A bar had been considered in 1957, but it was rejected almost immediately, which does make some sense. Would you be willing to leave 4,000 men and women locked underground for days with a sense of doom and an open bar? Good hooch simply wasn't important to the planning team, as they felt that the provision of a wet canteen had been considered and decided against in view of the number of additional staff required to run a wet canteen and the difficulties of arranging supplies of beer. Now that we have established their sobriety, we must clarify exactly what would be the functions fulfilled by the 4,000 men and women below caution. Each department had a specific function. The Foreign Office would maintain communications with allied and neutral governments, providing intel about developments in other parts of the world to the Prime Minister and the Chiefs of Staff. The military leaders were to formulate strategies for overseas and Navy commanders, including any unit armed with nuclear warheads. The Ministry of Works would immediately start planning for the reassembly of the government machine and its required infrastructures, while the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food had another daunting task, ensuring food supplies from overseas for the surviving population. Support might arrive from Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the rest of the Commonwealth, if they hadn't been attacked, of course. Finally, the Ministry of Housing and Local Government had the duty of planning for evacuation, maintenance of water supplies, ensuring first aid to survivors, caring for the homeless, and, the worst task of all, disposing of millions of dead bodies. While preparations for Turnstile were completed, Cabinet Secretary Sir Burke Trend had initiated a review of the plans. Trend and his analysts had one major concern. What if the existence of the CGWHQ at Corsham became known to the Soviets? In spite of all the thick reinforced concrete walls, they had a reasonable fear that a warhead of more than 10 megatons could easily take out the whole facility. So concentrating the whole government in a single location, or was it really a good idea? The report initiated an alternative plan, first codenamed Acid and then later Python. In 1968, Plan Python became the main contingency plan in case of a nuclear attack. The idea was to create several Python groups of senior ministers, officials, and military commanders. Each group would be relocated to a secure location at the onset of international tensions, presumed to be leading to a nuclear exchange. Each group would then have the authority to carry out government functions on its own. Turnstile, later renamed CHANTICLEE, would not be completely ditched. Some of its facilities were still to be used as a communications hub to allow for phone and telegraph exchanges among Python groups. After the attack and fallout had subsided, CHANTICLEE could be used as a rally point for all surviving Python members. The government decided to keep CHANTICLEE at least partially stocked and operational for another practical reason. It would divert attention from foreign agents, the press, and the public from the real secret, i.e. the Python plan. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the CGWHQ in Corsham gradually lost importance and was deemed almost completely obsolete after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 and the Cold War ended. Nonetheless, the government kept the facility secret until 2004, the cover story being that the bunker was a naval depot that also contained a communications center for the RAF. In 2004, the existence of EYEGLASS, yes, that's the last code name, was revealed to the public. At that point, it was maintained by a skeleton crew of 4, and most of the supply stocks had been depleted. Having very little idea what to do with a Cold War-era bunker in the 21st century, the government eventually decided to put it up for sale with a price tag of £3 million. Pretty good value for money, if we might say so. One of the prospective buyers was Californian Robert Vicino, a real estate developer and doomsday prepper who was looking to build a resort for survivalists. Other companies stepped forward with plans to convert EYEGLASS into a 1950s theme park, a massive nightclub for rave parties, or, my favourite, the largest wine cellar in Europe. The Ministry of Defence eventually pulled EYEGLASS off the market, perhaps due to parts of it being listed on the Heritage Register. With the bunker off the market and closed to visitors, the only chance you have to visit is to join one of the many urban exploration crews who have found secret access points. Or, don't, because it's dangerous and illegal. But I encourage you to watch their exploits on YouTube anyhow. If you want to know more about the CGWHQ, I recommend you visit the website burlingtonandbeyond.co.uk, which contains tons of information about its history. And I hope you enjoyed our descent into one of the lesser-known but more fascinating relics of a bygone age today. It's mad to think that just 1 or 2 generations ago, so many resources were devoted to frying into oblivion that half of humanity that we didn't like. At Geographics, we've covered many of these places, and I'm sure many more will follow. It's very easy to discover secret bunkers or launch pads located in major nuclear powers, but how about similar structures within the non-nuclear powers of NATO or the Warsaw Pact? Let us know your suggestions in the comments below. Please do check out today's sponsor Babel in the description, and as always, thank you for watching.